Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me along today. I thought what might be helpful is to say something about the more general situation that we're facing as the referendum approaches, and then to move back to saying something more about the business implications of what's likely to happen. Now, I do have form. I was the national agent, believe it or not, for the No campaign in 1975. So I've been around on this issue for really quite a number of years. And I've never myself felt any real antipathy to the EU or the common market as it was as such at all. And I do think that the common market and the economic community and then the European Union have in many ways done some very good things. I think they've been enormously important in bringing particularly France and Germany together after the war. I think the role that the EU played when the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe collapsed, pulling them over to the West, was really very creditable. But I do think the general perception in this country is in many ways the European Union has lost its way to some considerable extent more recently. My own view, which I think is pretty widely shared, is that the single currency, whatever the motives behind it, has actually turned out to be a disastrous mistake. And I have to say also that while I think that the free movement of people in Europe, which was a very important and distinctive feature of the early part of the European Union, when most of the countries were of roughly the same standard of living, worked really well, but it works much, much less well when you've got the huge economic gradient there is between Eastern and Western Europe. And I think immigration and migration in Europe is a huge problem, exacerbated, of course, by the enormous number of people seeking a new life in Europe that we see every day in the papers nowadays. Now, my concern about the EU really was always on the terms on which we joined. And I think that my view about what I felt in 1975 has been fairly well vindicated over the years. And I think this is really at the heart of a lot of the scepticism that you do find in the UK. And what I think most people in the UK undoubtedly would like to have is something along the lines that you've heard the first two speakers adumbrating. I think most people in the UK would like to be in the European Union, but they would like it to be very substantially reformed. They have very considerable concerns about the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy. They're concerned about the cost of us being in the European Union, which is actually very high. If you net off the benefits that we get, or the money coming back from the gross payment, you're still left with a net cost, which last year was £11.4 billion across the exchanges. So there is a very high cost there. There's considerable concern about migration, whether it really makes sense to have large numbers of people coming from Eastern Europe competing with the more disadvantaged members of our own labour force. There's a feeling we've got too much regulation, that democracies run not very effectively in Europe. And in particular, I think there is an enormous amount of concern in this country about the fact that we're not in the euro, but most of the other countries are. And there's going to have to be some recognition of the fact that this does leave us in a very different position from the other countries in Europe. And this actually, I think, probably provides the best possible opportunity there is for us to shape a new arrangement with the other member states in a way which would suit them in the end and would suit us. Because the reality is that if the single currency is going to hold together, there's going to have to be a very, very substantial change in Europe towards a far more federal approach. I mean, the European Union was always built on the principle of ever closer union. But what is really going to force this to happen is the fiscal and political changes which are going to be necessary to stop the single currency collapsing. But by about 2020, remember all the accession countries who came in, the ones from Central and Eastern Europe, all were, when they joined the European Union, were mandated to join the euro by 2020, which is not that far away now. Now, if that happens, then there's only 4 countries that will have an opt-out from the euro. of the euro, of which we're one. The other three are much smaller than us. That's Denmark and Hungary and Sweden. So we're going to have some arrangements in Europe which will accommodate the fact that we're in a different position. And I think that what most people in this country would vote for, I would guess you get 80 or 90% support for an arrangement where we stayed in the European Union, but on a much more intergovernmental basis than we've got at the moment, probably with us actually outside the customs union, but with a free trade agreement to be negotiated. And you may have seen David Owen has published a book recently which very much reflects this, with the idea that what you should have is a European Union, which are the countries that are in the single currency, which want to move towards having a unitary state, a sort of United States of Europe, and a community which would be those countries plus us, plus Norway, plus Switzerland, plus Turkey, plus possibly even one or two others, which would have a free trade area but operate on an intergovernmental basis. And I think that's what most people in this country would want. But frankly, I don't think that's what we're going to get. Because I think one of the really great disappointments is how very modest in the end the negotiating position of the Conservative government has turned out to be. And what we're likely to get, some movements on when benefits are paid out to migrant labour, some movements towards a sort of red card system for Parliament and so forth. But I mean, these are all very minor changes in relation to the big scene. And I think a big opportunity is being lost because we simply haven't articulated clearly enough what we would really like to see. And I think actually substantially in the interest of the other members of the European community, to the European Union rather, to go along with us, because what we really need is a stable relationship between the UK and the other countries in Europe. At the moment we're looking backwards all the time and holding them back, and if they want to have a United States of Europe and we don't, then there's no reason why, in my view, that couldn't be accommodated. So I think what's likely to happen when we get to the referendum in a few months' time is that we will have a debate around all these issues, and I think it's going to be a very tight pull. What I would say is that if the opportunity we've got at the moment, which I think has been wasted, finishes up by a narrow majority for staying in, which I think is a possibility, then I think a huge opportunity will have been lost. But the outcome may be that we come out, and that's what I want to turn to next. What impact will that have on the business community? And I think the two really crucial issues around this are, first of all, what's this likely to do with the prospects for the economy growing? And the second is what is this likely to do with the single market? Now, on the growth front, I think that if we are outside the European Union, that there are some substantial reasons for thinking that the growth prospects certainly wouldn't be any worse than we've got at the moment and might be considerably better. One is, as Ruth particularly said, at the moment, because of the terms of the customs union which we're in, we can't negotiate our own trade deals. And the record of the European Union in negotiating trade deals has not been that impressive. I mean, it really is ridiculous that Iceland, with about 350,000 people, can negotiate a free trade deal with China, and the European Union, with whatever it is, 350 million, can't. I mean, that can't make sense. So I think that our prospects for facing outwards, doing more in terms of global trade, negotiating these agreements would be better outside. One of the constant cries you get is that there's too much regulation, and I think this is another issue which actually is not so easy to resolve as often said. I mean, I'll tell you one thing from my bitter experience, and that is getting regulations in place is always popular with some people. Getting rid of them is never easy, because there's no regulations which don't benefit anybody. But the people who do benefit them tend to be a small number who are vocal in making sure that the regulations stay in place, whereas the costs tend to get spread over millions of people who can't be bothered to do much about it. But I must say there are some shocking figures that are published by the government showing that the cost of regulation in many cases is far higher than the actual benefits that are secured. And hopefully we do something to roll back that process. And then We move on then to just one final point about the growth factor is that at the moment we are paying this very large net sum into the European coffers every year. It's about £11.4 billion, which incidentally is quite a difficult figure to find. If you read the Treasury statistics, a lot of the time you find a much lower figure, but that's the amount of money that's paid into the EU budget. If you look at the Pink Book, which takes all the payments going to the European Union, you finish up with a much larger figure because this includes things like fines, it includes contributions towards EU projects like Galileo, the GPS system, and you add all this lot up together, you get to this much larger figure. So I think there are reasons for believing, at the very worst, that the growth rate of the UK economy wouldn't be any lower if we were outside the EU and might actually be considerably larger. On the single market, there are 2 or 3 points which I would like to make. One is that one of the problems about the single market and all the regulations that it entails is that it does impact on all the businesses in the country, not just those that are trading with Europe. Now, the number of businesses that have any sort of trading relationship with the European Union at all is very small. You talk about hairdressers and car repair companies. I mean, these people are all affected by European regulations, but really don't have any involvement with the single market at all. And so the complexity of these relationships, and I must say the business that I run, the amount of money we spend on dealing with regulations, and I'm sure this is a feeling shared fairly widely in this room, is really very substantial. And if we could get that reduced down to a more manageable proportion, that would certainly help. One of the interesting things that was one of the organisations I'm involved with, which is Business for Britain, found when it did a survey was that actually most businesses, quite a significant majority, I think it was 47% to 34% or something like that, actually think that the single market is more trouble than it's worth. So it's not true that business is wildly in favour of the single market. And it's absolutely the case, as again Ruth said, that if we were outside the single market, we could go on trading with Europe just as well as we are now. Nor actually is it true that it's essential for us to be inside the single market to affect the regulations that come from Europe. Most of them are actually passported on by the European Union from international bodies on which we're not represented. And one of the advantages of the Norway option, I don't think actually that's the best way ahead, but one of the advantages is that Norway is actually on the international bodies that formulate these regulations, and before they're passed on to the European Union, whereas we're not. And so they're actually, in many ways, in a stronger position to influence what's going on than we are. So looking at the whole picture, where does all this leave us? I think the decision we're going to take about whether to stay in the European Union or come out is an absolutely vital one for our future. It's going to shape the whole of the future development of our country over the coming years. It's a very, very important issue, but it's also a very complex and difficult one for people to get their heads around. I think that some people take the view that it would be an absolute disaster if we came out of the European Union. Others think it would be of a fantastic benefit. My own view is that the differences, in the end, are not as great as all that. I think the idea that we would be excluded from Europe in any meaningful way really isn't going to happen. With the enormous trade surplus that the European Union has, or the other member states have with us, the chances of us being excluded from their market, I think, is very small. Even if it was, the amount of tariffs that we'd have to pay is still much less than the contribution we have to make in total to the community budget, so we'd still be better off. I think on balance, we would find the economy would probably grow a bit more quickly than it otherwise would. I think we would have opportunities in international trade. I think we could get rid of some of the regulations that have been a burden from us. And I think that it might revive the British economy by, in the end, once we were free from the constraints that Europe's provided would give us a confidence and a zip which would do us very well in the future. So my own personal view is that if we could stay in the European Union on heavily revised terms, I'd be all in favour of it. But I think that if we're really going to get the tinkering, which looks to be like what's going to happen, then we probably would be better off outside. And with some reluctance, that's the way that I can see my future going in terms of this campaigning over the coming period. Thank you.